The next session is a panel discussion on modern classical works of Ebrahim Alkazi. In this, Amal Alana, Anuradha Kapoor, and Faisal Alkazi delve into the works of Ebrahim Alkazi, doyen of contemporary Indian theatre and one of India's leading post-independent theatre directors. The moderator of this session is Faisal Alkazi. Faisal Alkazi is an educationist, theatre director, and activist, and is actively involved in heritage education. He has, in the past 40 years, directed over 200 plays in Hindi, English, and Urdu under the aegis of his group Ruchika. He has also directed 30 films and over 100 productions for schools across India. Anuradha Kapoor is a theatre maker and professor. Her theatre work has travelled nationally and internationally. She has taught in universities in India and abroad. Her writings on performance have been widely anthologized. Anuradha Kapoor has been director of the National School of Drama, New Delhi, and is presently visiting professor at Ambedkar University, Delhi. Anuradha Kapoor.
So good afternoon to all of you. I know lunch के बाद बहुत देर तक जागे रहना इतनी आसान बात नहीं है. क्या lunch बहुत heavy था? No? Okay. Yes, big laughs I can hear. So obviously there's going to be a mix of responses. We'll try very hard to keep you awake. I'm sure we'll succeed. I think we should leave some lights on us as well. Okay. I'm just going to spend the first 7 or 10 minutes speaking with you all. I think this is a bit too dark. I know because of this visual of my father. Start by just introducing ourselves, because I know for a lot of you in the auditorium, that name Ebrahim Alkazi may not ring very immediate bells. ये ज़रूरी नहीं है कि क्योंकि आप ज़्यादातर छात्र हैं कि आप उस नाम को अच्छी तरह जानें. So I'm going to give you a very brief biographical sketch. As you know, I am Ebrahim Alkazi's son and Amal is Ebrahim Alkazi's daughter. So we are a very incestuous group here on the stage today. Okay? And Anuradha also. You're out of it? You're out of the immediate. Okay, immediate family. Okay. So just to wind back and give you a little idea, because then you can give a context to what we're talking about this afternoon. My father was born in the mid-20s in Pune. And Pune, as you know, at that time, it's not like it is now with that very big university and so much education there. लेकिन छोटी सी जगह थी, cantonment town थी, तो वहाँ पर बहुत interesting mix था लोगों का. So actually in the compound where he stayed, there was a range of different people. There would be some people who are Parsi, some people who were Afghan, some people who were Maharashtrian, and my father's own family was largely from an Arab kind of background. And constantly these people were meeting together and doing lots of different activities together. And my father was sent off to a Jesuit school. जो हमारे होते हैं ना ये सारे convent of this and St. Columba's, St. Xavier's, उस type का school. So English education, well-spoken English, reading, lots of Shakespeare, that kind of education was given to him. And he had a great interest from when he was very young in lots of reading. And his father had a huge library in the house. My grandfather was a businessman who lived in Bombay. And as we say in Bombay terms, every weekend वो up-down करते थे. Up-down का मतलब Bombay से Pune और Pune से Bombay. So coming up on Friday evenings to spend time with the family and going back on Sunday evenings. So largely they grew up under the shadow of my grandmother, a great fan of mushairas in Urdu, which she really enjoyed, and my father used to accompany her to these. As you know, at that time we were just pre-independence. It was the late 30s, early 40s. And in the school where my father was a student, in 1939 when World War II broke out, many of the staff members were put into camps because they were German. वो Germans थे and we were fighting Germany in World War II. So they were put into camps. And that was a big surprise to my father. And there was a lot of activity in the city because very often Mahatma Gandhi was there with his rallies, with lots of political kind of activity as well. And when he went to Bombay for his college education, that was even more interesting because he was on his own. He was staying with his father in a room in the office. And he was in a situation where he had a chance to go out and explore the whole city, not only the political part of the city, but he was already into acting because he was in school, done some Shakespeare there, but he also wanted to go and explore. So in college, he joined the St. Xavier's Dramatic Society. And there he met my uncle. My uncle was Sultan Padamsi, and Sultan Padamsi was the person who started a lot of the English language theatre in India. And Sultan Padamsi's younger sister, just immediately younger than him, was my mother. So this young man from Pune and this young lady from Bombay, who had grown up in a very different world because she was totally Western educated. She came from a very, very wealthy Bombay family, South Bombay. And they got together very early on in their lives, not even 20 years old. And they started acting together, being together in the plays done by my uncle. And my uncle's group, called the theatre group, was many people who were all brothers and sisters. So my uncle and many people in that family, including the names that you may know is Alec Padamsi. You may know the name Pearl Padamsi, Khatta Meetha. Okay, that's what everybody, Baaton Baaton Mein. Yes, so we have some idea of Pearl. Okay. So many people, Amin Sayani, the famous voice, Binaka Geetmala, one of my uncles. So a lot of the people who came together in my grandmother's house were all people who were interested and came together with theatre. And they came even closer together when in about 3 years' time, after they'd done 2 or 3 plays together as the theatre group, my uncle committed suicide. He was all of 23. And within that year itself, my parents got married. The younger sister to her married somebody from the theatre, and the younger sister to her married somebody from the theatre. So 3 brothers-in-law and 3 sisters, they intermarried at that time, and they carried on that tradition of the theatre group, very saddened by the death of Sultan Padamsi. And my father felt, by then we had just become independent at that time, so there was already a change in the air. And as Indians, we felt we had to create a very new kind of culture for our country, which was not westernized, which was drawing perhaps on Asian and European kind of roots for sustenance, which also was reaching out to a new kind of audience that was there in the theatre. So they were all looking at the same point of time, not only in theatre, but also across the arts, particularly in painting and sculpture and fields like that. So he decided to go off to England to study. He went to study art, and he landed up studying drama while he was there. And the interesting thing with him were 2 of his friends. One was a very well-known artist who you may not have heard of because he's died many years ago, Francis Newton Sousa. No? No, makes no sense. Very good at painting completely nude men. So one of the first paintings he did was this completely nude man. And the police came and said, you can't show a painting like this. So they put a plant in front of what was necessary to be covered. This is in the late 1940s, okay? And a very well-known poet of that time, Nissim Ezekiel. So the 3 of them, they traveled together to England. And then my mother was also there, and so was Sousa's wife, Maria. And London, you know, at that time, आजकल का वो London नहीं था. क्योंकि अभी अभी हाल में ही World War II ख़त्म हुआ था, तो सारी buildings were bombed out. There was very few restaurants that was there. They in any case were very poor students. तो कहीं-कहीं पैसे इकट्ठा करके they would go to see an exhibition or to see a play. But the art scene was very, very vibrant, whether it was paintings or whether it was theatre. But the theatre they were doing in England at that time was पुराने style का. बड़ी-बड़ी auditoriums, लगभग 1200 लोग बैठे हुए एक साथ, 3-tier seatings like you can still see sometimes when you go to London, and acted in an old-fashioned style, focusing a lot on Shaw, on Sheridan, on Shakespeare, on those kind of writers, whereas theatre had really moved on. So my father got very interested in just studying outside of drama school, which he finished and did very, very well, doing a lot of the main Shakespeare parts while he was there. And he and my mother, who was very interested in clothes and costumes, clothes for the stage, so they would spend a lot of time in the museums and also a lot of time in libraries. And a lot of change had occurred in Russia just after the Russian Revolution of 1919, 1920, and very new ideas had come up in the theatre, and very new ideas had come up in Europe about the theatre. So we didn't have to do realistic acting. They were all talking about a more symbolist theatre, a different kind of a theatre movement. So they read all the plays that were being translated from the European languages, from Russia. They learned the new kind of acting techniques that were now there. The name that some of you all may understand is somebody like Stanislavski, who was a big influence. He had died many years earlier, but his work was still there. And by the time it was the early 50s, these three gentlemen particularly, Nissim Souza and my father, felt they would have quite a big role to play when they came back to India and started working in India. And they were thinking very much on a national level. क्योंकि जो बॉम्बे में पलते हैं, उनकी दुनिया मुंबई के बाहर है ही नहीं. वो पूरी दुनिया होती है. You know what I mean? So they started thinking in a different kind of way. My father came back to the theatre group, worked with them for some years, started a new unit called the theatre unit, and they more seriously got into understanding theatre. So one name you will all recognize, one of his students, Amrish Puri, Mr. India. What is he called? Mogambo? Khush hua. Wohi line hai na? So he was one of the first students. Vijay Anand, Goldie Anand, Dev Anand's brother, who did all the famous films, Jewel Thief, Guide, who directed all those films. He was one of the first students. Among many other people, some who are still acting on the Delhi stage like Kusum Haidar. So they all congregated together in Bombay, and they were part of my father's training program in a very interesting building, not unlike India International Center or Triveni Kala Sangam, maybe closer to Triveni, called Bhulabhai Desai Institute. तो वहाँ पर गौर कीजिए कि कौन-कौन था. So one place, my father's directing his plays. Next room is Pandit Ravi Shankar giving classes. Next room, Wahida Rahman is waiting to practice her Bharatanatyam after my mother has stopped doing her practice and come out. Next room is Gaitonde's studio, very big artist. M.F. Hussein's studio, all in the same building. Next door is a bookshop, the first arts bookshop perhaps in India, run by Sakina Mehta Tayyab's wife. So everybody was in a tiny area, not very big at all. And then my father did an even more interesting thing. We lived, my sister and I and my parents, in a large flat. And the flat was interesting क्योंकि तब उन्होंने खरीद लिया जब बन रहा था तो उसमें दीवारें नहीं थी. बेशक बाथरूम और किचन की दीवारें तो थी, okay, वो दीवारें थी, but otherwise it was a large big room, maybe 3 times the size of the stage. Am I right to say that? Yeah, not very large. You know, Bombay में flats बड़े नहीं होते. तो हमारे घर के अंदर ही मैं और Amal was often acting because she was older than me. We would be sleeping right there. और यहाँ पर rehearsals चल रही हैं मीडिया की या Waiting for Godot या इतने सारे plays. और बहुत जल्द, at the huge cost of 150 rupees a month, he hired the terrace above our flat. We lived on the 5th floor. तो छठी मंजिल पर वहाँ पर बिल्कुल खुला मंच. तो ऊपर तारे, वहाँ पर Arabian Sea, and an open-air theatre which seated about 80 people and did very formidable plays there of a very new kind of theatre which was emerging in the West. So new writers, the first person who was writing very strong plays in theatre of the absurd, Samuel Beckett's Waiting for Godot's first production was done over there. Euripides' tragedy, Medea was done over there. Yerma was done there. So many plays at that time. And it was interesting because a lot of young students from all over India and a lot of people who lived in Bombay came regularly. So for instance, another name you're familiar with, Girish Karnad? Yes? So Girish Karnad, not in his film star avatar, which is very much there, but as a young student on his way to England, used to come upstairs to see the plays. And in an interview he said very recently, a few years before he passed away, which was last year, that was his first exposure to looking at Western stories and myths and legends like Orpheus and Eurydice and Antigone being interpreted in a modern style. And he said that pushed me towards writing in that way. Because actually, he said, in Indian tradition, we very rarely have tragedy. That concept doesn't exist at all. But here I saw these beautiful plays, and quite soon after seeing, I think, Eurydice and Antigone, he wrote his first play, Yayati. He just reinterpreted a myth from the Mahabharata. By that time, my father had already come to Delhi. Delhi had only one theatre, Sapru House, which is still there. There were no other theatres in Delhi at that time. IFAX had not been built. And he had brought a production of Oedipus, Raja Oedipus, in English, with him playing Oedipus himself. And it was seen, and then he was invited to come and head National School of Drama. But he felt he was not very ready. So he spent some time, learnt Hindi very well to prepare himself to be at this stage, started directing plays in Hindi in Bombay before coming over here. And in the early 60s, he moved to Delhi. Now, Delhi was at a very interesting point of history because, you know, Pandit Nehru and the first people who made up the cabinet, they'd inherited a city that was largely British built. तो अंग्रेज़ों ने ये लचन्स दिल्ली तो बना दी, लेकिन बनाते ही उनको जाना पड़ा. They didn't really inhabit that space, the imperial capital. You know what I mean? India Gate, Rashtrapati Bhavan, all these layouts of Delhi. And it's a very different, it's Rajon ka city. You know what I mean? It's an expression of colonialism. And Delhi was tough because there was no culture which was contemporary. If there was any culture, it was Purani Delhi ki culture, Shahjahanabad. So they were trying to create, my father among many people, for instance, the man who designed this particular space you're in, you'll notice there are jalis, which are taken from Mughal architecture. You'll notice that the outside is clad in stone, which is taken straight from the area around Qutub Minar, that kind of idea. So people were trying even architecturally to build something new. So as my father was doing in the theatre, so were Indrani Rahman, the dancer, Yamini Krishnamurti, the dancer, reviving older forms, Odissi and Kuchipudi respectively. So was Briju Maharaj trying things in Kathak. So a lot of change was occurring in the art scene. और हर एक के दिमाग में एक ही बात थी that how are we going to be Indian and how are we going to be contemporary. We want both the things. We want the best of our traditions. So among the first exhibitions done at Rashtrapati Bhavan was of Indian sculpture. So a lot of the sculpture from the Mathura Museum was there in Rashtrapati Bhavan. And it was the first time that M.F. Hussain and Souza and others were seeing these works and getting inspired by Indian sculpture. So when my father came to Delhi, first play he managed to find, it was a play that had been written about 7-8 years earlier, Ashar Ka Ek Din, by somebody who came out of the Nahi Kahani movement in Hindi, very big writer, Mohan Rakesh. Uske naam ko aap jante hain? School mein padha hoga, one story, it's in your book, NCRT book, okay? So Mohan Rakesh's Ashar Ka Ek Din was the first play he did. He did it open air in a tiny angan. NSD used to be in Kailash Colony. तो वहाँ जाने के लिए रेल की पटरी पहले, फिर कहीं पर गीदड़ों की आवाज़, कहीं पर लहराते हुए खेत, और फिर आप पहुँचेंगे NSD में. And open air he did this production, and it had wonderful set of actors in it, many who became big names in movies also, Om Shiv Puri, and a name again that you all will know, Sai Paranjpe. Maybe you all know this, okay, because you've seen some of her movies. Yeah? So Sai was acting in that first production as the princess, which years later Anuradha played in the film, in another film, in a film version of it. So that was Ashar Ka Ek Din, and almost immediately, Firosha Kotla ke ruins mein, he did another fabulous play by Hindi writer Dharmavir Bharati, Andha Yug, और वो भी खुले में था. वो है कि महाभारत के युद्ध के बाद the survivors who are there, the stories of those survivors after the war is over. What happens to those people? It's a very bleak, dark play. It's in rhyming verse, difficult to do, but they did a production. और मज़े की बात है, जब पंडित जी आए थे देखने के लिए, तो एक बहुत फेमस डायलॉग है प्ले में, मार दिया उसको मार दिया, तो पूरी सिक्योरिटी पर्सनल भाग के स्टेज पर आ गई कि किसी ने कोशिश की पंडित जी को मारने की, of which of course was not true, because in the play it relates to Ashwathama and another scene. So that was just the beginnings of new things happening at NSD. Very quickly, one policy that he adopted that was very interesting was actually people were writing in the regional languages. Girish was writing in Kannada, Vijay Tendulkar was writing in Marathi, Badal Sarkar and others were writing in Bengali. तो बहुत ही जल्द जैसे ही प्ले उस भाषा में प्रकाशित या स्टेज पर आता था, तो उनको उसका अनुवाद करके वो बहुत ही जल्द यहाँ NSD में करते थे. So it became a meeting house of people from all over India who could come. And there was a lot of cross-fertilization of ideas that occurred. And along with that, because he'd had very good training of a certain kind in the theatre, he brought in a very interesting 3-year course, and he was very good at directing and molding actors. So many of the actors that you admire today, whether it's Nasiruddin Shah or whether it's Om Puri and many others, are people trained by my father in their years at the NSD. And it just developed a huge reputation. Many national academies come up, but NSD somehow got a reputation of its own and largely held on to that reputation for many years after that he left. So I'm just going to talk about this part of his career. I think my sister is going to talk more in detail, and Anuradha, as the non-family person, is going to bring her own perspective to it. But this just gives you a little idea, because I know so many of you all are students who are here. Was that quite clear, accessible to you? Yes, got a little idea? Okay, I'll hand over to Amal.
It's wonderful to be here, and thank you so much to the organizers for inviting me. This is, of course, a sheer pleasure to talk about a history of theatre which one has lived through. One has experienced, as Faisal has said, Faisal and myself have experienced theatre right from the time we opened our eyes, because theatre was done in our home. But I shall take a little bit of a different slant, and I hope it is all right. It might be a little more mature, and a little bit of a, I think it's very important that Faisal has laid the ground to understanding the entire movement as it was unfolding. So let me begin. Being the daughter of Alkazi, it is a strange, tangled privilege to write or speak about my father or any other family member for that matter. There are so many aspects of my parents' work, life, and personalities that one has been privy to the extent that their world has practically become a part and parcel of my own experience. My attempt, therefore, is to historicize the ideas and work of Ebrahim Alkazi within the context of his times and see him as one among many of his brilliant contemporaries who fashioned himself to play a role, a significant role, in the creation of a new modernity for the stage and for the nation. Yes, Alkazi, even as a very young man, was presumptuous and determined enough to believe that he had an important role to play in the creation of a culturally vibrant new India. He was clear that to fulfill such a destined role, it was necessary to educate himself and cultivate his sensibilities to the best of his ability. His primary goal was to study modernity, a modern way of expressing in art firsthand, both in the fields of theatre and the visual arts, his twin passions. He was also clear why he opted to be educated in England rather than France, despite the fact that it was Paris, not London till that time, that was the cultural capital of the artistic universe. Alkazi was also clear that unlike his contemporaries, the famous painter who went on to become famous, Raza, Akbar, and Souza, who had ventured abroad to feed their own creativity as artists, Alkazi was committed to returning to India to share the entire experience of current modernistic trends with his countrymen in order that they in turn develop a modern sensibility and a modern culture for India. Having sorted and settled out these choices that pertain to his future, the young Alkazi disembarked at the age of 23, disembarked from the SS Stratheden at Tilbury in England to face a very unwelcoming, grey, soggy, drizzly English morning in 1948. It appears that modernity, both as a philosophical creed as well as a genre of expression, resonated with Alkazi's own experience and his sense of self. For what was Alkazi's identity? Alkazi was of Arab parentage, as Faisal has said, born and brought up in Pune. From as far back as he could remember, he sensed that he did not entirely belong. He did not feel at home. By upbringing, he had inherited three cultures: an Arab culture at home, an Anglo-Indian Western culture made available through schooling at a Jesuit school, and a local, extremely hybrid Indian culture in the shape and form of his neighbors, whom again Faisal has talked about, being a cross-section of Hindus, Muslims, Jews, Catholics, Parsis, and Anglo-Indians. These Alkazi observed rather than interacted with directly, as his family members were not so keen that he mix freely with other students and other neighbors. Interestingly, the Alkazi family also did not share a very Indian Muslim culture either, as we understand it. Perhaps it is only when Alkazi, so therefore Alkazi was the recipient of various cultural inputs. So perhaps it is only when Alkazi went to Bombay and where he saw a vast number of different kind of people interacting that he certainly felt more at home. And it was here that he began to construct out of all these new experiences some kind of identity and worldview that was rooted in the present, since there was no real past associated because from where he belonged. The cosmopolitan character of Bombay, which again Faisal has referred to, with migrants from all over the world, from Bombay having its German Jews, its Russian Jews, its Baghdadi Jews, a large number of Arabs, Pathans, Chinese, British, Italian, Portuguese, Dutch, and later Americans too. It was perhaps in this kind of internationalist atmosphere and this cosmopolitan atmosphere that Alkazi felt more at home, belonging to an international diaspora. Gravitating towards a circle of young persons who were internationalists in their views, who were animatedly discussing modernist ideas, Alkazi befriended, as again Faisal has mentioned, my uncle Sultan Padamsi, who was mounting very, very modern plays at both his college and in the new theatre group which he founded, the theatre group. His other friends, F.N. Souza was a young painter at that time studying at the J.J. College who had communist links, and he was already thinking about a movement in the arts of setting about and forming a progressive artist movement along with the people we have mentioned, Raza, Hussain, Bakri, and Gade. Nissim Ezekiel, who was teaching English, would later become the chief proponent and founder of a whole generation of English poetry by Indians, while Mulk Raj Anand, one of the forerunners of the Progressive Writers Association, who had internationalist links, would go on to establish the Marg magazine for the arts. So these were among Alkazi's friends, young people who were living, working, and imbibing ideas and practices from across the world and who were involved in fashioning a new modern movement for the arts. To shift to our next point, so why modernity? Part of the answer possibly lay in Alkazi's description of the turbulent times through which he was living. To quote one of his sentences, in the 1940s, a younger generation of artists carried along by the tumultuous events of their times, the Quit India movement of 42, the Bengal famine of 43, the naval mutiny of 46, and the carnage of the partition of 47, all of which roused the conscience of Indian artists. All this led almost inevitably to the emergence of the Progressive Artist Group and its first show in 48. The overall style of this group reflected the turbulence and unease of their times. For Alkazi, like others, modernity then was a means of expression that reflected the fragmented social and political reality through which he and his generation were living. It rejected, in the world of theatre, the efficacy of faithfully reproduced reality that the picture frame or the proscenium stage of the 19th century had advocated. I know that this is a lot about the terminology that we use in theatre, but I think it will be interesting for you to understand some of this background which important people in our country have thought about, experienced, and either embraced or rejected ways of doing things. Thematically, When trying to uncover some of the repeated thematic strands that Alkazi consistently returned to as a theatre director over a span of roughly 5 decades, from the 1940s to the 1990s, we find that, broadly speaking, one of the main thematic concerns is the predicament of women and their challenge of the patriarchal order. Whereas in plays which deal with women like Ibsen's Ghosts, Strindberg's Miss Julie, Lorca's Yerma, Mohan Rakesh's Ashad Ka Ek Din, or Chekhov's The Three Sisters, the battles waged by women take place within the domestic space of the home, whereas in others like Antigone by Sartre, Euripides' Medea and Trojan Women, the battle engaged in is on the larger political arena. The other theme that Alkazi returned to repeatedly are plays that deal with wars. Plays that deal with wars, with revolution and political turmoil, often drawn from history, wherein the subjugated make an anguished bid for democratic and humanistic freedoms, and where ethical and moral questions regarding the means whereby this can be achieved are questioned. These productions of Alkazi included Dharamveer Bharti's Andha Yug, Girish Karnad's Tughlaq, Balwant Gargi's Sultan Razia, Badal Sarkar's Hiroshima, Shakespeare's King Lear and Othello, George Buchner's Danton's Death, Edward Bond's Narrow Road to the Deep North, Shudrak's Mritchakatikam. Then again, there are texts like Moliere's Tartuffe and Lorca's Banada Alba that deal with religious bigotry, or like Premchand's Hori that deal with casteism. All these plays selected by Alkazi were on extremely currently debated 20th century issues, like the fight for women's independence or the fight for political and social freedoms against strong dictatorial regimes. Texts that continue to be very, very relevant to us even today, and especially today. Selected by Alkazi from an international pantheon of classics, all these plays are international plays written at different times in different languages. And Alkazi is doing them for his audience in Bombay and then later for an audience in Delhi. So selected by Alkazi from an international pantheon of classics that spanned from the Greeks to Shakespeare to Moliere to Ibsen to Chekhov, Strindberg, etc., 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 down to T.S. Eliot, Harold Pinter, which you might have read about in your Western literature classes, Edward Bond, or from Shudrak and Kalidas, down the ages to Mohan Rakesh, Girish Karnad, Balwant Gargi, Badal Sarkar. Through these productions, Alkazi took his students of the theatre group, his students which he had at the theatre unit in Bombay, and later his students at NSD and the Living Theatre in Delhi, as well as his audiences from both these cities, through not only a study and an understanding of world dramatic literature and performance styles, but also allowed us to understand the turning points of major social and political upheavals that have altered the course of history. So this is a very vast panorama. Alkazi is side by side, by doing all these plays, teaching the audience as well as his students. These then were classics that Alkazi offered us in the form of theatrical experiences that were contemporary and modern in their sensibility, relatable to us in our own times. These were not looking like very ancient plays, they were looking like current plays. Since practically all these plays were translated from English or other Western or vernacular languages of India into Hindi, under Alkazi's own guidance, we are the recipients of a very valuable legacy of not literal but very playable translations of all these plays. So we have all these plays with us in Hindi. In Hindi, a whole pantheon of world dramatic literature. This in itself is an enormous and extremely valuable asset and archive. The fact that Alkazi's productions, now I'll talk a little bit about how he did the plays. The fact that Alkazi's productions drew enormous crowds, they were extremely popular, speaks in a sense of him being able to capture the imagination and speak in a new language of theatrical articulation, a new language of the stage that he as a director was exploring. One of the key elements of modernity in the theatre was to expand theatrical language to be able to capture unspoken feelings, experience reality as sensations, a narrative that was not necessarily linear. Towards this end, Alkazi began to explore non-verbal means, silences, sounds, and heightened expression, the use of masks, of dance, and choreographed movement. He began to use them as evocative means to communicate ideas and emotions rather than just relying on words. None of the productions of Alkazi I have mentioned, even if they were by playwrights like Henrik Ibsen, who is regarded as the father of realistic drama, or other plays written to be performed as realistic drama, was staged by Alkazi within box sets or littered with realistic clutter. Always visualized as modern ritual reenactments and refined through a poetic rendering, Alkazi constructed a mise-en-scène, meaning an entire picture of what would happen on the stage, mise-en-scène, where the assembling and integration of all the audio and visual arrangements of text and imagery raise the entire theatrical experience to a delicate sensory level. This subtle balance between visual expression through the combination of gesture, expression, lighting, choreography, color, within the designed environment of the stage space, and the rendition of text as an integrated musical composition for the expression of thoughts, in tandem with often recorded music and punctuated with silences, was an expression of perhaps what Alkazi understood as the assembling or the assemblage of a Gesamtkunstwerk. Gesamtkunstwerk is a German word which means, Gesamt means coming together, all, coming together of an artwork which is bringing together several elements, a term used by Wagner in the 19th century to describe a new form of visualizing and treating a text that involved the coming together of all the theatrical arts as one orchestrated whole. I will skip some bits. And so it was that all Alkazi's productions, even though they were dealing with the examination of history and or political regimes like Tughlaq, Sultan Razia, Narrow Road to the Deep North, Danton's Death, which talks of the French Revolution, Hiroshima, etc., were staged and visualized to be theatrical experiences where theater was treated as a form of art. This description of an Alkazi performance, these descriptions of Alkazi's performances makes it quite clear why the study of all the arts in an integrated manner became the cornerstone, became the basic principle on which Alkazi devised a syllabus for training of the modern actor, which was imparted at an institution like the National School of Drama. The actor should be aware of painting, music, literature, dance, and further to integrate this study with an understanding of theater traditions, of older theater traditions. In this way, the actor learns to become a poetic ensemble player in the modern integrated theatrical experience that Alkazi was proposing. To conclude, let me say that what I have spoken about today is a very, very small part of Alkazi's contribution to not only theatre, but to the art scene as a whole. In the field of theatre, Alkazi saw himself not just as a creative director or as an accomplished actor. Alkazi saw himself as a facilitator who had the energy, drive, and vision to create vibrant institutions and create circumstances within which all the arts, theatre, painting, photography, etc., could flourish. To therefore discuss Alkazi's theatre productions or his pedagogic approach to, say, acting or stagecraft as being modernist and therefore revolutionary for his times would be limiting the expansive vision of modernity that he envisaged. He is one of the few among theatre people of his time to take upon themselves the building of an approach towards the nurturing and supporting of theatre in a sustainable manner. Both in Mumbai and later Delhi, he took it upon himself not only to train young men and women in the theatrical arts, but more importantly, to also train an audience to understand and appreciate modernity in all the arts. The citizens in both cities, in Bombay and in Delhi, the cities Alkazi lived in, became Alkazi's students, his constituency. He felt responsible towards them. He needed their time. He needed to capture their attention and their imagination. Through the years, Alkazi's reputation has grown, and he has been able to reach out to more and more people who would normally not attend theatre by taking theatre throughout his career to them, to schools, to colleges, to factories, to villages, touring with his students and the repertory company he built up. When asked once again, while at NSD, when Alkazi was once asked while he was still at NSD in the 70s, who his audience was, he said, "Looking out of the window of the National School of Drama, you see a woman at work on a new building, on a new modern building, rising 10 to 15 floors. She carries stones on her head with her child strapped to her back, helping to set up a modern structure which will present within its walls a theatrical experience. In what way is the experience of theatre related to her? You find a 5,000-year-old woman holding a transistor in her hand, and suddenly time and space have acquired a completely different meaning. Unless I can take into the experience of the theatre this new concept of time and space and this new concept of experience, I cannot talk to that 5,000-year-old woman. These are some of the problems I have." End quote. Thank you so much for being patient and listening.
I'm just going to present to you some of my ideas, and in a way I speak for a generation of theatre people who have seen and admired much of the work of Alkazi Sahab. So we are here today to talk about Alkazi Sahab in the context of the city. And I think it's important and urgent, as it were, to remember this city as being something that was seen as full of institutions that were connecting different kinds of cultural and intellectual practices, that sought to define the democratic vision of a newly independent India. That was part of the dream of the city of Delhi when Alkazi Sahab came to work here. Though I was never a student of Alkazi Sahab, in that I never formally studied at the National School of Drama, but in so far as Alkazi Sahab shaped the theatre culture of the city by his shaping influence at the NSD, an institution that came to define and fashion the very notion of theatre making and theatre production, spectatorship, audience protocol and behavior, of theatre as an overall experience, in profound ways, I was his student, as were many of my generation, being part of these foundational redefinitions. After almost 3 decades in the classroom as a teacher and director at the NSD, and as a theatre maker, I feel more strongly how profoundly Alkazi Sahab shaped Delhi's theatre-going experience to this day. Some months ago, a friend of mine asked, what you mark as one of the landmark events in terms of theatre histories of independent India? While I don't think there can be a single landmark decision or event, but surely one, however we may define landmark, is the creation of an institution like NSD, and tied to that, the coming of Alkazi Sahab as its director in 1962. Alkazi Sahib's theatre training and his vision of what a modern Indian theatre was to look like and how it was to be taught, and that's going to be my primary focus, defined some of the debates that are still part of our theatre making process. What is modern, and how does the traditional, the cosmopolitan, and the international intercut this, as Amal pointed out? Are these at variance, or do they shade or slot into each other? Are these matter for conceptualizing theatre training, pedagogy, and the futures of theatre making practices in India? There can be a variety of readings and critiques of the way these materials were shaped, but that they became part of the debate is important enough, and part of the curriculum is important, I think, important, thoroughly important for what we are today. I think it's a matter of enormous significance to recognize that instance when an institution becomes something that is able to shape theatre cultures outside itself, that of a city and even much beyond that of the debates in India, for instance. Let me here plot the NSD within other institutions conceptualized at the same time. Delhi, among other cities, saw the formation of several arts institutions in the 1950s, like the academies, the National Gallery of Modern Art, the National Museum, which was in 1949, and the National School of Drama, which was created in 1958. These institutional initiatives were themselves part of the larger Nehruvian vision to create an infrastructure for the practice, study, and public manifestation of the arts in terms of India's modern and contemporary culture. And I think that's really important. And here, just a quick definition of culture: cultivation, caring, and tending, understood as being part of a process of intellectual, spiritual, and aesthetic improvement through the public role of cultural institutions. And here, within this parameter and within this network, is placed NSD. As we know, the academies of literature, music, and dance, Sangeet Natak, Lalit Kala, Sahitya Academy, were mandated to archive forms and to disseminate them through exhibitions, publications, performances, to establish libraries, as well also to maintain spaces to generate public performance, dialogue, critique, appraisals. Within this, the mandate of the SNA and later the NSD was to discuss the material conditions, the dissemination, and the consumption of theatre production in the present and for the future. The for the future is important. Yeah. We know that drama schools as 3 to 5 year courses, largely established in the first part of the 20th century, were seen as agents of modernity. And here I'd like to point out that that's really important, because they disconnected the Guru Shishya Parampara and offered, and which I think is again important, a very democratized process of admission and broke open the gharana. What Alkazi Sahab brought to the teaching of theatre was a kind of curriculum which was about the liberal arts. That means there was a study of history, there was a study of literature, but there was also a study of skill, a model that was part of the British drama school. Skill, makeup, carpentry, voice, and various things like that. He also brought in, and I like to conclude with that, 3 things that I think are contemporary understanding of what is modern theatre or the training for modern theatre. He brings in the idea of rehearsal. We take it for granted that theatre has a rehearsal. But what he presents to us is a rehearsal which is training to understand what is acting, what is pause, what is silence, what is dialogue. He brings in an understanding of, for instance, realism. The Stanislavski toolkit. What is subtext? What is said? What is not said? How does the actor bring it onto the stage? And I think this part, this introduction of a Stanislavskian toolkit becomes really important. And the other part, which we again don't take necessarily for granted because we think of it as being completely part of our theatre grammar, is the notion of the workspace and punctuality. Why should I be on time? Because theatre is an ensemble art. Why should I not have a party in the rehearsal room? Because the rehearsal room is a place for work. Why should I actually have a respect for the rehearsal room? Because the rehearsal room produces knowledge. And here, I want to end by remembering Alkazi Sahab, and it's a very precious memory to me. At the gate of the studio theatre at the Lalit Kala Academy, he used to stand at the gate while we would enter. I was a student then, a school student. And I remember that presence, and the presence was very clearly welcoming me to the theatre, but also telling me, as he stood very attentively to the audience, that there is an audience protocol. We were going to enter a theatre which was going to tell us something about our lives, that it was a piece of work that had been struggled and labored upon for many months, that the actors were there to present a life that was lived, and that they were sharing it with us. And his standing at the gate gave me a sense of how important theatre education, an institution like the National School of Drama, which he had shaped, was to the culture of Delhi. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Anuradha and Amal. I think we just have time for some quick questions. Maybe, no, not even that? Okay, so we don't even have those 5 minutes. Thank you for being such a wonderful audience, and I hope you've got some insight into the theatre of Ebrahim Alkazi. Thank you.